Hey everyone, Quentin Figueroa here with Slayermint.com, and I'm going to talk about how N's, intuitives, are smarter than S's, sensors, in the MBTI. So let's take a look at that. Now, I know a lot of people might be a little upset by me saying something like that because they will say, well, with MBTI, it's all a preference and there's no MBTI that's greater or less than another. They're all just preferences. They all have their pros and cons. They all balance each other out and that kind of thing. And while there's truth to that, there's also distinctions that can be made with the MBTI. We can easily see that certain temperaments are going to be more emotional, or some will be more organized, or some will be more talkative and social and different things like this. So we already use the MBTI to see certain trends with certain temperaments. So to find the trends for which ones are smarter is doing pretty much the exact same thing. But for whatever reason, people get really upset when you start talking about intelligence. But that's what we're going to do. So let me give you a definition of sensing and intuition. So this is from Wikipedia. It says, sensing and intuition are the information gathering functions. They describe how new information is understood and interpreted. People who prefer sensing are more likely to trust information that is in the present, tangible, and concrete. That is, information that can be understood by the five senses. They tend to distrust hunches, which seem to come out of nowhere. They prefer to look for details and facts. For them, the meaning is in the data. On the other hand, those who prefer intuition tend to trust information that is less dependent upon the senses, that can be associated with other information, either remembered or discovered by seeking a wider context or pattern. They may be more interested in future possibilities. For them, the meaning is the underlying theory and principles which are manifested in the data. So that is the definition from Wikipedia, and I think that kind of gives you a pretty good idea of the difference between the two. Sensing, people who sense, they're more kind of in the immediate real world. They're more into details, facts, concrete things. They're into going with what can be determined based off the kind of their physical body and that kind of thing, where intuitives are more kind of big picture. They're more into seeing patterns between things, how things relate. They're not as into specific steps, but into kind of the overall goal or mission, like I said, more futuristic, more future oriented, and that type of thing. So that's kind of the difference between sensors and intuitives. So, intelligence. Now, obviously, intelligence is a hard thing to define. It's hard to define what smarter means. It can mean different things depending on the context and the application at hand and that kind of thing. So, yeah, of course. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to define intelligence as basically influence. So, people that are more influential are probably going to be more intelligent. And maybe intelligent isn't quite the right word, but there is something that influential people have. So if you have somebody who is, say, running a business like Steve Jobs, he, for whatever it is that's going into making him be the guy running the business rather than some employee or some guy who's just taking orders from him, whatever that difference is what I would call intelligence. And that's what intelligence is in the scope of this video, is if you are influential and people see you as influential and they trust basically, or they listen to your decisions and your judgment over theirs, or at least over majority of people's, then you are showing intelligence by doing that. People aren't going to follow people that are stupid. They're going to follow people that are smart in general. They want people that are better, that are smarter, that have more to offer than people that are going to be dumb and hurt them. They want people that will help them, and intelligence and all these things kind of act towards that. So that's why we're going to use influence. So I assembled a list of influential people through the internet, and that was done primarily by going through Google and just searching for most influential people in history, and searches like this: who's the most influential person historically speaking, who has done the most for mankind, stuff like that. And if you do that, you'll quickly find patterns of names that are going to come up, and I'm sure most of you would suspect that, like Jesus and stuff like that. So you're going to see stuff like that, and that's what you do see. And based off that, I figured we could take those names and we could see what their MBTI type is. Obviously, people are going to say, okay, you can't measure the MBTI of somebody who's dead. You can't measure, but you can pretty much figure out who it is, because you could take a living person, figure out what theirs is based off the attributes of them, how they act, things like that. You could figure out what they are, and then you could have them take the test, and then you could confirm that what they took on the test is pretty much in line with what you thought they were based off their attributes. So you could do the same thing with dead people. It's not really that tricky. And a lot of people do that kind of thing, and there's a lot of different lists where that's been done, and people have tried to type, some of these older people in history and that kind of thing, and a lot of them say the same thing because it's kind of obvious with a lot of these people. Some of them not so much, but it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to kind of give you a trend of what their temperaments were and what this all means. So some of these people that were shown as influential in history were Abraham Lincoln. He was an N. Adam Smith was an N. Adolf Hitler, N. Albert Einstein, N. Alexander the Great, Aristotle, Augustus Caesar, Benjamin Franklin, Bill Gates, Buddha, Charles Darwin, Francis Bacon, Galileo. All these people are N's. Some INTJs, some INTPs, ENTPs, different things, but they're all N's. And I'm pretty sure most people would agree with most of the people on the list so far. I mean, if you go search it on Google, you're going to see this same type of people come up. Gandhi, he's an INFJ or an INFP, so he's an N. Now, George Washington, he comes up on the list. A lot of people say he's an S. He probably was a censor, so he's not an N, and he was still influential. Isaac Newton, N. Jesus, N. John F. Kennedy, John Locke. Joseph Stalin, they say, was an S. Julius Caesar's an N. Karl Marx, N. Leonardo da Vinci, Beethoven, Martin Luther King Jr., Michelangelo, Muhammad, Napoleon, Nikola Tesla, Pablo Picasso. Pablo Picasso's an S. He shows up on the list. I don't know if he's that influential or not, but he's a great artist. Plato is an N. René Descartes is an N. Sigmund Freud, Thomas Edison, Thomas Jefferson, Walt Disney, Warren Buffett, William Shakespeare, all N's. So I think like 3 people on this list were S's. All the rest were N's. So there's a lot of N's when it comes to influence and who people find influential in history. And all these people also all have above average IQs. The average IQ being 100. All these people are like in the 150s. And again, how do you measure IQ of dead people? Same type of thing with measuring IQ of living people. You can quickly find out things like that based on attributes. So all of these people have above average IQs. They're all influential. So you're already seeing certain trends with this. So in regards to the IQ, obviously there's different ways to measure intelligence, and IQ is just one way, but IQ is a very good way. And a lot of people who aren't familiar with IQ think that it is just it's a test that measures only one type of intelligence, like it measures more your pattern recognition and that type of thing. And while that's true, the way IQ actually came about was by finding the core patterns in any type of intelligence test possible. So you hear there's kinesthetic intelligence, there's musical intelligence, there's 8 or 9 different types of intelligence. IQ actually takes all those into account, because IQ is based on what's called the G factor, the general factor, where all of these different tests all share a common general factor, which if you have a high general factor, which is IQ, if you have a high G, you're going to do better on all of these different types of tests. So IQ is actually a pretty good measure of intelligence. It's not the only way, but in general, people with high IQs are smarter and more capable than people with lower IQs. And I mean, we see this pretty much everywhere. There's countless examples of that type of thing. So yeah, there's different intelligences, but IQ is a pretty good measure. And of these influential people, they all have high IQs, and I don't think that's a coincidence. In fact, I think that's probably one of the smartest things you could see as a correlation between these people, because it's pretty much right on point. So to call that a coincidence or to call IQ irrelevant is basically going against data, and it's going against what makes sense, so it's kind of weird. Also, the military uses IQ. They've been using it for over 100 years. And they use it because they know that they don't want to put smart people on the front lines, and they'd rather use the smart people in a more capable way. So if it's good enough for the military, it's probably pretty good for other purposes as well. And so we know that leaders and influential people are rare, just as smart people are rare. Most people are average, and to see somebody like a Steve Jobs or a Thomas Edison or a Jesus or somebody like that, that's rare. And if you look at the number of N's to the number of S's, you'll see that majority of people are S's. They're not N's. So it's more rare to be an N. N is about 20 to 25% of the population, where S is like 75 to 80% of people are S's. So it's a lot rarer to see an N than an S. And that itself would also give credence towards N's being smarter, because the average person isn't smart, and whatever the majority is usually isn't an extreme or a special case. So being rare in this case would be more favorable for N's, and that's basically what they are. If you look at the split between E and I, it's basically 50-50. The split between F and T, it's very close, and the split between J and P is very close. But the split between S and N is not 50-50 or close. It's like 20%, 80%. So it's not like as much a preference. And that's the thing. A lot of people think that intuition or sensing is a preference, and that's pretty much what MBTI theory says. And I don't really agree with that. If you look at most of the other stuff like T and F and J and P and E and I, those are probably more so preferences because they're more kind of inconsequential. It's like a color. It's like red versus blue is more or less a preference. It isn't one is better or worse than the other. It really is. They're both equal, but they're different ways of kind of doing something or choosing something. But with S and N, it's not like that. It's not like you're choosing S or N and both are equal. Because N's can usually do things that S's can't do. So it's like the N is like an extension or a higher magnitude of the S. So when you have an N, it's like somebody who can do things that S's can't do. It's like a higher grade in school. So if you have a third grader who only knows addition and subtraction, that third grader can't do calculus because they only know addition and subtraction. But if you have like a 12th grader who does know calculus, then they are more capable because they can do calculus, but they can also do addition and subtraction. So if somebody chooses to be an S who's incapable of doing things that an N can do, they're not choosing to be an S, they're incapable of being an N. So it's not really a preference for an S, it's a reality for an S. And the N is more so choosing to be the N, because they could more so be an S and do kind of 5 cents immediate things, but they choose to go past that and go into deeper things and to see broader patterns and things that leaders do, things that smart people do. That is what's going on with N's. So it's kind of it's an evolution thing, not evolution in the sense of survival of the fittest or like physical. It's more like a mental evolution. It's more like a how far up the intelligence scale do you want to go? And that's kind of what an N is. So it's more so how far you want to go as far as evolving your intelligence or your capacity to reason and to take information in and to make good judgments and to have wisdom and practice love and all these different things. So we all start out, for the most part, as sensors, or at least society in general is shaped to make us more in a confined box, which is something sensors more or less prefer. So we all kind of start out and go to school, we listen to our parents, we listen to our religion, we listen to the government, all these sensor type organizations that tell us what to do and guide our lives. But there's not much decision making going on. This is more like a sensor thing. You're doing more so what you're told, but you're not creating your own reality. You're living the reality that is put in front of you, and you're basically following that path. Now, most people, since most people are S's, pretty much choose to remain in that paradigm. So they continue going on as sensors, and that's perfectly fine. But some people kind of recognize this pattern and see what's going on, and they realize that they want to more or less participate in their own free will, and they want to make their own decisions, and they want to create their own things, and they want to expand themselves beyond the normal reality that this sensor world has created. So we start out as sensors. Majority of people continue being sensors, but some people develop their intuition, and basically they want to grow it, and they want to continue to expand their own consciousness. And that's kind of where that dichotomy happens. Ends basically say, I want more out of this. I want to grow more. I want to do more. So they pull themselves out of the system, and they're able to be on their own and more independent, which are, again, all attributes of being a leader, being intelligent, being smart. And I know a lot of people will disagree with this, but if you look at the test questions and the way people answer the test questions, it actually shows the exact opposite story. Because a lot of the people who test as N's, like on online tests and stuff, they're actually S's, but they err on the side of N because they lie about it. Most people want to be N's because when you read the test questions and you answer them, it sounds better to be an N. It's like the smarter thing to be. So people err on the side of N. You don't have people erring on the side of S. You don't have like an N who really is an N who will say, oh, I came out as a ESFP. They don't do that because it's the S's that err on the side of N because they want to be an N. And I could illustrate that because I'll show you some questions. So on one of the online tests, it says, you often think about humankind and its destiny. Now, this is obviously a question that determines whether you're an S or an N. An N would be more likely to think about this kind of thing where an S wouldn't. But when an S sees this question, they think, oh yeah, that sounds good. I'll do that, yeah. So they lie about it. They lie about it because they know if you don't think about humankind and its destiny, you're probably kind of not a good person. Or it's like, why would you not think about that? So more people would lie about that are S's trying to be N's than the other way around. People are going to lie towards being an N on that question. Another one, you often ponder the root cause of phenomena and things. So again, that's an SN type question. People who ponder the root cause of things are N's. They're looking at the kind of the core of something rather than just smaller segments of something. They're trying to get at the core of it, the root at it. And again, an S would read that and be like, oh yeah, sure, that's me. And they would lie about it. Another question, you prefer to act immediately rather than speculate about various options. So S's obviously are more impulsive and act more quick than N's. N's are going to be more thoughtful and methodical on something. And it's not that it's necessarily good or bad to go one way or the other, but most people would think that taking your time, or at least putting thought into something, is better than just impulsively doing something without thought. And that's why people would lie on a question like that. When considering a situation, you pay more attention to the current situation and less to a possible sequence of events. So again, this is an SN question, and the S's are not going to plan the sequence of events that happens from a particular event. They are going to look at just one thing at a time and not see how one thing relates to another and will cause something in the future and how different pieces connect. But when people see a question like that, they'll be like, oh yeah, it's smarter to do that, so I'm going to lie about it and do the N answer even though they're not an N. Another question, you easily see the general principle behind specific occurrences. This is totally N. This is what N's do. But, well, sensors know this, and they will lie about it because they want to see the general principle behind specific occurrences. Another question, you are more inclined to experiment than to follow familiar approaches. And again, experimentation is something an N would do because it's going outside of the normal sensor box. You're going and doing something that's not necessarily known. You're going into the unknown area, which sensors don't like doing. But sensors know that experimentation is good, so they're going to lie about it. So on all these types of things, even though people will say that you can't say one's better or worse than the other, not better, you can't say that one's smarter than another, right? But when you look at the questions and the way people answer them, you clearly can see which are the better answers or which are the smarter answers. So it's obvious. And that's why you see a lot of people who come out as N's on the tests but aren't really N's. And then if they take it again or they more accurately take it, it'll show that they're S's. And then obviously there's degrees of this, right? So there's 100% S or 100% N. And if you're like barely an N and mostly S still, so you're still pretty much an S. But if you're 100% N, that's a lot different than 50% N. So there's degrees of all this as well. So, most of this, the aspects of the N, coincide with sound philosophy, with business sense, with spiritual teachings, and general self-improvement. And that's why most of the leaders throughout history, whether it be a spiritual teacher like Jesus or Buddha, or whether it be a businessman like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, or any other type of leader, they're going to be N because N coincides with this wisdom, this intelligence, and that's why. So, yeah, there's lots of examples you could do with that, like how thinking in the long term is generally more beneficial than thinking in the short term, and sensors think in the short term, and intuitives think in the long term. Seeing the big picture is generally more intelligent than seeing just a small little picture of something. Because seeing the big picture doesn't mean you only see the big picture but not the small picture. Seeing the big picture means you see both. And that's where it comes into that cumulative effect, like being able to do third grade math but also 12th grade math, where the sensor can only do third grade math. As an intuitive, you're able to see both. You can see the big picture and the small picture. And this fits in with a lot of other things than just MBTI and temperaments. It fits in with what's called the RK selection theory. So R's are the RK selection theory is basically a dichotomy of kind of how species evolve, And R's are kind of more like sensors. They're more kind of in the immediate moment, and they don't think necessarily about the future or their survival, and they don't necessarily think about the repercussions of decisions. They just make decisions in the here and now. Where K is more like the N, and that actually is more future oriented and thinks more about the long-term consequences of actions and things like this. And so this obviously ties in with politics, because you're going to see how the sensors care more about the immediate effects of certain things and certain choices, where the N's are going to care more about the longer effects and the long-term kind of repercussions of the choices that they make. So all this stuff goes together, and it becomes more clear the more you look at it, and the more you tie it in with things outside of just temperaments and personality. Because if something is true, then every way you look at it should not tear apart the truth, but it should reinforce it. And that's what happens with the SN relationship in MBTI. And I know most people will say that that's not how it works, but if you look at the actual data, like IQ, if you look at actual patterns, if you just think about it and study it, it shows this as more true. If you look, it sounds good to say they're all equal and they're all the same, and I know it makes a lot of people feel good, but would you rather feel good and not understand something, or would you rather actually understand it and maybe not feel as good, but actually be correct or be right in the way you're measuring it and understanding it? So I'd much rather get to the bottom of something and know what's going on, so I can use it in the most accurate, beneficial way, than to use it inaccurately and just, feel good and be a social justice warrior and, tell people, oh, we're all equal, everything's the same, choices don't matter, it's all preferences, because it's clearly not with the S and the N. And I know you've been wondering the whole time, well, what about the cognitive functions? What about the functions? How does that tie in? Well, I'm glad you asked. So, in regards to the functions, let me pull this up, because the functions tell the exact same story I've been telling the whole time. They don't make anything different. So, with the functions, you have 4 orders of functions, right? You have the dominant, which is a primary, and then you have the fourth one, which is the inferior. So with N's, intuition is either the first or the second function on all N's. And with S's, intuition is going to be third or fourth on all S's. So it doesn't matter what type of S you are, it's going to be either your third, intuition is going to be either your third or your fourth function. Where as an N, intuition is going to be either your first or second function. So N's obviously prioritize intuition more than sensing, because for an N, sensing is either third or fourth, and for an S, intuition is either third or fourth. So even with the cognitive functions, it's saying the exact same thing, which is that N's prefer intuition over sensing, and because of that, they're more intelligent. So thank you very much for listening. Have a great day.